We're now going to look at two more poems which we could use for essays on the AQA political and social protest paper. We're going to look at how settings are used, particularly in the Garden of Love and indeed in the Clod and the Pebble, the two poems we're going to look at. The power struggles are implied rather than actually explored. There's certainly a sense of a ruling political class at work within the Garden of Love, and control is a key word there. He's always connecting the smaller world to the larger, often through metaphors and symbols. Seems to be some issues of social class implied within all his poems, really. And we can always look at the structural and language patterning. We'll see here some issues of authority, of powerful and powerless people. The power of the church is a big focus in this particular poem, The Garden of Love. Voicelessness is always a key theme in Blake and one worth looking at. In terms of methodologies, we'll see two poems here that are structurally interesting as they develop, particularly the Clod and the Pebble has a very clear and examinable structure, but so I think as the Garden of Love develops and finishes in a slightly different way than it starts. And in terms of our themes, these poems would be useful for most of these questions that have come up in the past. Again, the outlier is that personal relationships one, which we could argue there's not anything specific about personal relationships in these two poems, but although particularly in The Clod and the Pebble there's actually quite a lot there that's implied about the way in which we might relate to somebody in a way that involves power. So personal relationships in political terms are really examinable through the dynamics of power within a relationship. So the two poems, we're actually again going to start with Clod and the Pebble, because I think it's the simpler poem. You can see it has a very straightforward structure in which there's two voices. The first and the last stanza are separate voices, and the middle stanza identifies the character who spoke the first lines and the character who will speak the final lines. And very clearly, in a very neatly differentiated structure, we have here the two ways of looking at love, a kind of theory X, theory Y, it's sometimes called, view of humanity. Here is implied that there are those who see all human actions in terms of selfishness and self-interest, and there are those who see the possibility of selflessness, that it is possible to be genuinely loving. The Christian idea is that we should put others before ourselves, we should put the interests of others in front of our own interests, and be loving in that way, and that genuine love is not about a calculation of what you can get out of being nice to somebody or pleasant to somebody or loving to somebody. It's more about what you can do for the other, and that is proper love. There's a suggestion that it's not really love if you are doing it for purposes of gain. I will buy you a box of chocolates because I know you will buy me one back. So I'll be nice and loving to you because you're nice and loving to me. When I say I love you, what I mean is I want you to love me. I want you to show an interest in me and to do good things for me. So the Clod starts things off in a very upbeat way, a very liberal way, a very open-minded way of saying love is this Christian love, true love, builds a heaven in hell's despair. So in spite of the pressures to be hateful and cruel, we do good things in this world and make a good world out of it. However, the fact that these words are spoken by a clod of clay that is then trodden on with the cattle's feet reminds us of the potential dangers of that rather naive view, that we become vulnerable to the power of others. Perhaps it's a weak view. that you're just constantly giving and giving and never receiving anything back for all that you give, and people take advantage of you and literally walk all over you. The Pebble speaks the alternative view, so the pebble is hard and resistant and is not going to be crushed. The meters as in lines of poetry, meet as in fitting, correct, but it may be that he's being sarcastic there when he says that, and that he says that these are things that hateful and cruel people say. But is it just realism that the Clod is being optimistic and hopeful, but the Pebble is realistic and is not going to be defeated because of that? They know that people aren't going to give anything willingly. They're always going to seek to gain things for themselves, and so you've got to be on your lookout for that, and you've got to make sure that you don't get taken advantage of. Now, of course, the danger of that view is that you become hard, like the pebble, hardened to the world, and you don't give anything yourself. You're not very loving. You contribute to this world of cruelty, coldness, hardness, hatred, and make it worse rather than trying to alleviate it in any way. Because you're so tensely fearful of being cheated and abused, you don't open yourself up to the possibility of being loved. So the poem offers those two alternatives. It doesn't say which it favours. It hints strongly that the clod of clay is going to be trodden down, but then it's perhaps being sarcastic about the view of the pebble. The pebble doesn't sound necessarily to be a better way of living, although the pebble gets the final word. Blake leaves the reader to decide where you want to sit on this, which view you want to take. Or is it possible to take a view in between? In terms of using this for the essays that have been asked so far, where Blake might offer no hope of escape for constraints, was the first question ever asked. Well, here, the lack of hope is the pebble. The pebble's saying, well, there is no hope, there is no goodness in this world, really. You're just going to have to be tough and strong, stand up for yourself. Oppression and control are what the cattle does to the pebble, to the clod. When if it tried to do that to the pebble would resist. So the resistance to any kind of imposition of authority, the human spirit having the power to resist, is kind of exemplified there. But does that make you tough and hard and unloving, and does it make the world a hard and cruel and very isolated place? The marginalised, again, could be the clod of clay. Ooh, no hope for you, you get trod on, and your naivety is made capital of by those around you. So authority figures not being kind or compassionate. Well, this is about whether you can be compassionate in this world. The poem is saying, is it worth being compassionate, or will you just get crushed if you try that? Innocence here does not lead to joy and happiness, but rather to being squashed under the foot. So the poem is a simple poem, I think, but it doesn't give us any answers. Slightly more complex would be the Garden of Love. Because what is the Garden of Love here? It's a metaphor for something. Is it simply to be taken, this poem, as a reasonably realistic story in which you have a garden and somebody builds a church on top of it? And, well, that seems to me to be an unlikely scenario for Blake to be particularly agitated about. It seems likely that by calling it the Garden of Love, he's asking us to see this symbolically. He doesn't call it a particular garden. He calls it the Garden of Love, which sounds like something from a myth or a legend or the Bible. So we have here this idea of the Garden of Love, which of course makes us think a little of the Garden of Eden too, of a sort of idea of paradise, of a place of good and of value that then gets built upon by the church. So it's perhaps the idea of the original Christian ideas, which are about love and are inspiring and hopeful, get turned into something solid and sort of institutional in the church, and that's rather crushing. And the church then decides to interpret this loving philosophy as something that should be all about thou shalt not. So these lists of commandments, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. So it's about a Puritan view again of religion that says religion really is a way of telling you what things to avoid and how to avoid being sinful by doing, largely speaking, as little as possible in the world, and certainly not enjoying anything in the world. Now, literally, the garden, the land around the church gets turned into a graveyard, so we can see graves, but metaphorically, the church becomes a thing of death in the final stanza. And then we end the poem with what are two lines with internal rhymes, or perhaps four short lines. The priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. And this is his most explicit image of the unsympathetic, controlling church. That classic question from 2019 of the religion is about misery rather than comfort and joy. Those would be your lines there. They bind desires is again that Puritan thing of anything that you are interested in, excited by in this world is bad. Anything you want, anything you wish for in this world is sinful and a temptation away from religious thought and self-discipline. But Blake doesn't believe that. Blake finds that view of religion stifling and very uncongenial to his idea of human instincts and human desires are good things, and human beings are naturally good, and therefore what they desire is naturally good. So in this poem we have here the sense of constraints that can't be escaped from. We have not parents but religion as the controlling force here. We have the human spirit resisting by noticing these things and complaining about them, but that resistance is limited, that they are bound in the end. And that might make us think of infant sorrow and the bound and weary in that poem. Authority figures here, particularly at the end there, are unkind and lack compassion, but the whole of the poem really seems to be depicting the authority of the church as something tough, solid, rather like the Pebble from our earlier poem, hard and uncompromising and unloving, and very much therefore against the kind of message of Christian thinking, the Christian Gospels, which are all about giving and loving. So innocence and joy here get crushed and destroyed. The innocent joy of the garden is turned into a graveyard, a thing of death. Religion is a thing of death, both because of its sort of grim unpleasantness, but also because, as we saw in a poem like Chimney Sweeper Innocence, there's this sense here that death is the only joy that a believing Christian can expect, that they might well expect to suffer in life in order to meet their heavenly reward afterwards. But for Blake, that really isn't good enough, that life can't just be a one long pain which you finally escape from. It has to be something of value in itself, and therefore, to create the kingdom of God on earth, we have to do something about the suffering in this world now and help others and ourselves to appreciate life for what it is, to take delight and joy in our desires and our wishes and our hopes. So a great point to use for many questions, because it's about religion, which is a driver to Blake, but it's also just generally about authority and control and lack of freedom, and fits with all the other poems that exemplify that. A really useful one to have at the forefront of your thinking and turn to quickly in the exam, depending on the question.